In August of 1851, a 12-year-old black boy named Elijah Moore did something that stunned even the most hardened men in rural Mississippi. He saved the life of the white trader who had sold his mother 3 years earlier. Witnesses counted 7 stab wounds, 2 broken ribs, a collapsed lung. The boy knelt in the dirt, pressed his hands into the man's bleeding chest, and refused to let him die. White society in Yazoo County was scandalized, but they had no idea what Elijah had already set in motion. By the following spring, 4 men would be dead, 1 plantation would vanish from records entirely, and a story would circulate in whispers that no ledger could explain. What really happened that night on the river road? Why did the boy choose mercy, for the one man who deserved none? And what did Elijah know that made grown men afraid to sleep? Before we uncover the disturbing truth, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your state below. Now let me take you back to where it all began. The Mississippi Delta in the summer of 1851 did not merely surround a man. It claimed him. Heat lay across the fields like a punishment that never ended, thick enough to press breath from lungs. Cotton stretched to the horizon in pale rows that caught the sun and threw it back with a cruel brightness, while the air hummed with insects that fed on sweat and blood alike. Spanish moss sagged from the live oaks along the riverbanks, gray and limp, like funeral cloth hung in advance. Even the soil smelled old, iron-rich, damp, and faintly sweet, as though it remembered every body that had ever been worked into it. The land did not care who owned whom. It made that decision itself. Plantations rose from the delta like fortresses built on silence. White-pillared houses set back from the fields, their paint too clean for the labor that sustained them. Behind those houses lay the quarters, low, crooked cabins pressed into the earth, doors warped, windows bare. Smoke from cook fires drifted each evening, thin and bitter, carrying the smell of cornmeal and boiled greens. Children learned early not to cough too loudly, not to cry if they could help it, not to ask questions whose answers might be dangerous. In this place, a boy learned to watch. Elijah Moore was 12 years old and already understood that listening could be safer than speaking. He had a narrow frame and long limbs that made him seem taller from a distance, though up close he was still unmistakably a child. His skin was the color of dark river silt after rain, his hair cut close to the scalp, not for neatness but because lice thrived in the delta heat. His eyes, steady, dark, and unsettlingly calm, missed little. People remarked on his quietness. They called it obedience. They were wrong. Elijah belonged to no single man in the way older hands did. Since his mother sailed 3 years earlier, he had been passed from task to task. Water runner, errand boy, stable cleaner, small enough to move unnoticed through spaces where grown men attracted attention. He slept where there was room, ate what was left, learned the rhythm of footsteps on porches and the sound of keys against a belt. He learned which boards creaked in the main house hallway and which doors were never locked because their owners believed no one would dare. What no one noticed was how carefully he remembered everything. Each morning began before the sun had fully lifted the fog from the low ground. A horn sounded, flat and impatient, and bodies stirred from the quarters. The air at that hour was almost cool, a brief mercy before the day tightened its grip. Elijah would rise without complaint, pull on his shirt still damp from the night before, and step outside into the half-light. Dew soaked his bare feet. Somewhere down the row, a woman hummed a tune so low it barely existed, a sound meant only for herself. He carried water from the pump to the fields, the bucket's handle biting into his palm. Men barely looked at him as he passed, their focus fixed on the overseer's horse and the whip looped casually at the saddle. The overseer that season was a man named Rourke, red-faced and perpetually sweating, who believed cruelty worked best when applied without passion. He spoke little. When he did, it was final. Move. Yes, sir. That was the extent of most conversations. The Delta economy depended on this silence. Cotton prices were strong that year, and merchants in towns along the river talked of expansion, of new land cleared farther south. Traders came and went, their wagons heavy with chains and papers, their boots polished as if to distance themselves from the filth of their trade. Enslaved people learned to recognize the sound of those wagons long before they appeared, a hollow rattle that tightened stomachs and emptied cabins of laughter. Elijah listened for those sounds even when none were present. At night the delta changed. Fog crept in from the river, swallowing fences and paths, turning familiar distances strange. Frogs croaked in the ditches, and insects struck lantern glass with dull, frantic taps. In the main house, voices drifted through open windows, laughter, clinking glasses, the low murmur of men discussing crops and debts as if they were the same thing. Sometimes Elijah was sent to stand outside those windows, waiting to be called. He kept his head down, eyes unfocused, while words spilled out over him. Sold well last season. Another shipment by fall. Boys too quiet. You watch the quiet ones. That last comment came from a guest whose face Elijah never saw, only the shine of his boots as he stepped onto the porch. The man laughed afterward as though he had made a joke. Inside, others joined him. Elijah did not react. He had learned that stillness unsettled people more than defiance. Above him, on the porch rail, a moth beat its wings against the wood, leaving pale dust behind. Elijah watched it struggle, the movement frantic and purposeless, until it finally fell to the ground. He wondered briefly how long it would live there. What Elijah did not know, what none of them knew, was that the delta was already shifting around him. Routes were being marked in ledgers he had not yet seen. Names were being written that would one day burn. Choices were being made in rooms where his presence was dismissed as insignificant. But the land remembered him. It remembered the boy who walked its edges in silence, who felt the weight of heat and history pressed down and did not break. It remembered the night air filling his lungs as he stood listening, committing voices to memory, filing them away with a patience that did not belong to children. This was the land that owned men. And it was here that Elijah Moore began to understand how ownership could be undone. Elijah Moore remembered the day his mother vanished, not by the screams, though there were screams, but by the way the air smelled afterward. It was the smell of churned dust and horse sweat, of leather warmed too long in the sun, of fear pressed into the earth by too many feet standing still. That smell stayed with him long after the noise faded, long after the wagon wheels creaked away, long after the plantation returned to its careful, practiced silence. It was September of 1848, and Elijah was 9 years old. The trader arrived just after noon, when the heat was sharpest and the fields shimmered like water. The horn sounded differently that day, shorter, urgent, and work slowed, then stopped. Heads turned. Hands froze mid-motion. Everyone knew the sound of a trader's arrival, even if they pretended not to. The wagon came down the dirt road slow and deliberate, as if savoring the attention. 2 horses pulled it, both dark, their flanks lathered white. A man sat high on the bench seat, hat pulled low, boots polished to a shine that looked obscene against the mud-caked road. Chains lay coiled beneath his feet like sleeping snakes. Elijah stood near the edge of the yard, a bucket half filled with water hanging forgotten from his hand. His mother, Ruth, was a few steps ahead of him, her back straight, her movements measured. She did not look at the wagon at first. She had learned, as many had, that acknowledgement invited inspection. The man dismounted with practiced ease. He smiled as he spoke to the owner, his voice smooth, confident. "Good stock you have here." Ruth's shoulders tightened. Elijah saw it, though no one else did. The inspection was efficient. Names were called. Bodies were turned, mouths opened, arms flexed. The trader asked questions that sounded polite and carried no politeness at all. Ages, skills, temperaments. Children were pulled close to their mothers, only to be pushed back again when hands reached for them. When the trader stopped in front of Ruth, he paused longer than necessary. "This one," he said. "Strong." "How old?" 32, the owner replied. "Good in the fields. No sewing too." Ruth spoke then, her voice calm despite the tremor in her hands. "My boy stays with me." The trader looked down, noticing Elijah for the first time. His eyes flicked over the child and moved on, already calculating. "No." The word landed heavy. Final. Elijah felt his mother's fingers brush his arm just once. A warning. A goodbye. He did not yet know which. The bargaining happened quickly. Coins exchanged hands. A paper was signed. Ruth was told to step forward. Elijah tried to move with her, but a hand caught his shoulder and held him back. "No," the overseer said softly. "Not you." Ruth turned then. For the first time that day, she looked directly at her son. Her face did not break. She would not allow it. Instead, she lowered herself to his level, ignoring the trader's impatient sigh. "Listen to me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You remember who you are." Elijah nodded, though his throat burned. "You listen more than you speak." Another nod. "You do not forget." She pressed something small and warm into his palm, a scrap of cloth torn from her dress, the edges already fraying. "Keep this." "I'll come back," Elijah said, because children always say such things. Ruth smiled, slow and sad. "No," she said. "But you will live." The trader cleared his throat. "That's enough." Chains were brought out. Not for Ruth, she walked on her own, but for others whose names followed hers. The wagon filled with bodies pressed close together, knees knocking, eyes staring straight ahead or nowhere at all. Elijah stood where he had been left, the bucket slipping from his hand, water spilling into the dirt. No one noticed. All eyes were on the wagon as it turned, the wheels cutting deep grooves into the road. As it moved away, Ruth did not look back. That, Elijah would understand years later, was its own kind of mercy. The wagon disappeared into the heat, swallowed by distance and dust. That night, the quarters were quieter than Elijah had ever known them. No murmured prayers. No whispered stories. Only the crackle of fires and the soft sounds of breathing. Elijah lay awake on the hard pallet, the scrap of cloth clenched in his fist, his nails digging into his skin. What he did not know, what he would not learn for years, was where the wagon went. South, deeper into the delta. Through towns whose names never reached him. Onto roads where ledgers mattered more than people. Ruth Moore was sold again within a week, then again before winter. Each sale stripped her name a little thinner, until it became nothing more than ink on a page. But Elijah did not know that yet. What he knew was absence. In the days that followed, he watched the spaces his mother used to occupy, the spot near the fire where she cooked, the place by the pump where she washed, the path she took each morning toward the fields. Those spaces felt wrong, like teeth missing from a mouth. Men avoided his eyes. Women touched his shoulder in passing, brief and careful. No one spoke Ruth's name aloud. Names had weight, and weight could pull a person under. Elijah adapted. He always did. He took on more errands. He moved faster. He spoke even less. At night, he replayed his mother's last words over and over, fitting them together like pieces of a puzzle he did not yet understand. Listen more than you speak. Do not forget. What none of them realized was that forgetting was never a danger for Elijah Moore. Memory settled into him like something alive. And one day it would demand to be answered. Caleb Hargreave believed himself a reasonable man. He told this to anyone who would listen and to many who would not. Reasonable men, he insisted, did not act on impulse. They kept records. They planned routes. They understood that sentiment was a luxury for people who did not deal in realities. In 1851, the reality of the Mississippi Delta was cotton and flesh, and Hargreave traded in both with equal detachment. He was 46 years old that summer, thick through the chest, his hair already thinning at the crown despite his careful grooming. His clothes were always clean, his boots polished even on days when the roads were little more than mud and ruts. He smelled faintly of bay rum and ink. People noticed such things about him because he wanted them to. Appearance, he believed, separated professionals from brutes. His wagon moved constantly. River towns, inland markets, plantations tucked deep into the delta where names were known only locally. He knew which owners were desperate, which were ambitious, which could be pressured with the right suggestion of debt. He knew the value of silence and the cost of noise. Above all, he knew numbers. At night, by lamplight, he opened his ledger. The book was thick, its leather cover cracked and soft from years of handling. Inside, neat columns marched down the pages. Names, ages, skills, prices, destinations. Hargreave's handwriting was precise, almost elegant. He took pride in that. A man who could not keep orderly records, he believed, could not be trusted with larger responsibilities. Some names were marked with small symbols in the margins, codes known only to him. A circle for those likely to run. A cross for those with illness. A dash for family connections that might complicate a sale. Children were noted briefly. Children he knew were adaptable. They survived. Women were assessed differently. Strength, fertility, temperament. Hargreave told himself this was not cruelty but efficiency. Buyers wanted predictability. He provided it. What he did not account for was memory. On the afternoon he purchased Ruth Moore, Hargreave had been irritated by the heat and eager to finish his business. The boy, Elijah, registered only as an inconvenience, a small variable best removed from the equation. He remembered the woman, of course. Strong arms. Steady eyes. No visible illness. A good price. He did not remember the child's face. That omission would cost him dearly. By 1851, Hargreave had begun to sense a change in the Delta, though he could not have named it precisely. There were more patrols on the roads, more questions at river crossings. Abolitionist pamphlets appeared now and then, tucked into crates or left in taverns, only to vanish again by morning. He dismissed these signs as irritations rather than threats. Noise, he told himself. Nothing more. In Yazoo County, where he often passed through, white society regarded him with a mixture of respect and distaste. Plantation owners needed him, but they preferred not to think about what that need said about them. They invited him to dinners, offered him whiskey, then spoke of him afterward in lowered voices. He does the unpleasant work, one man remarked once, as if that absolved everyone else. Hargreave accepted this role gladly. Unpleasant work paid well. On the river road just south of town, he was known to travel alone. He trusted his reputation and his pistol. He trusted, too, the unspoken understanding that violence against a man like him invited consequences. Patrols would ride. Questions would be asked. Punishments would follow. This confidence made him careless. The night it happened, the air was thick with fog rolling in from the river, muting sound and shrinking the world to the narrow beam of his lantern. The wagon moved slowly, the horses snorting softly as they navigated the uneven ground. Hargreave hummed under his breath, thinking about the figures he would enter into his ledger before sleep. He did not hear the first footstep. The attack came fast and without warning. A shape emerged from the fog, then another. Someone shouted. A blow struck his shoulder, spinning him sideways. Pain flared, sharp and immediate. He reached for his pistol and found nothing but air as another landed, this one lower, driving breath from his lungs. He fell hard, the lantern shattering, darkness swallowing everything. Hargreave screamed then, the sound raw and animal, nothing like the measured voice he used in negotiations. Knives flashed briefly, catching what little light remained. He felt them enter his body, once, twice, more than he could count. Each impact stole something from him. Breath, strength, certainty. The men fled as quickly as they had appeared, disappearing into the fog with his blood on their hands. Hargreave lay gasping in the dirt, the smell of iron filling his nose, the world narrowing to the ache in his chest and the cold seeping up from the ground. He thought dimly that this was how it ended. A mistake. A miscalculation. Then he heard another sound. Lighter footsteps. Careful. A face appeared above him, young and dark, eyes reflecting fear and focus in equal measure. "Do not move," the boy said. Hargreave tried to speak, to demand help, to assert himself, but only a wet sound came out. The boy pressed his hands against Hargreave's chest, applying pressure where blood flowed freely. His movements were sure, practiced. "Breathe when I tell you," the boy said. "Not before." Hargreave obeyed without understanding why. Later, much later, he would remember those eyes and wonder why they felt familiar. He would search his memory and find nothing. He would tell himself that the boy was just another child, another face among many. What he did not know, as he lay bleeding on the river road, was that the boy kneeling over him had been shaped by his choices. And mercy once given could not be taken back. By the time the patrol arrived, the fog had begun to thin, lifting in ragged strips from the road as if the night itself were retreating from what it had witnessed. Boots thudded into the dirt. A lantern swung. Horses stamped and snorted, uneasy at the smell of blood. The men moved cautiously at first, pistols drawn, scanning the tree line for shadows that no longer held anyone. When they reached the body in the road, a murmur passed between them, surprise then something like embarrassment. "Traitor," one of them said. "Still breathing." Caleb Hargreave lay on his back, shirt soaked through, eyes glassy but open. His breaths came shallow and uneven, each one sounding like it might be his last. Kneeling beside him was a boy, hands slick and dark to the wrists, pressing down with a focus that bordered on ferocity. "Who's that?" another man asked. Elijah did not look up. "Boy," the first patrolman said. "Step away." "Not yet." The word carried no defiance, only fact. Elijah shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his hands. Blood oozed slower now, though it still flowed. He had learned, by watching and remembering, how pressure worked. He had learned how bodies failed. Hargreave made a sound, half groan, half plea. "See?" a third man said. "Boys tending him." They exchanged looks. This was not how such scenes usually went. Violence on the river road was familiar enough, but mercy, especially from a black child toward a white traitor, felt wrong, out of place. "Why?" someone asked, not expecting an answer. Elijah finally looked up. His face was streaked with sweat and grime, his eyes steady despite the chaos around him. "Because if he dies," he said, "they will come looking." Silence followed. The men considered this. It was practical. Reasonable. They liked that. "Step back now," the patrolman repeated, more gently this time. Elijah eased away, his knees protesting as he stood. His hands trembled then, the effort spent, and he wiped them on his trousers without thinking. The blood left dark smears that would not come out. They lifted Hargreave onto a stretcher improvised from fence rails and a blanket. He cried out as they moved him, the sound sharp and humiliating. No one commented on it. Pain had a way of equalizing men. "Where did you learn that?" one patrolman asked Elijah as they prepared to move. Elijah shrugged. watching. They left him there when they rode off, the lantern light bobbing away into the distance. The fog swallowed them quickly. Elijah stood alone on the road, the smell of blood still heavy, the night suddenly too quiet. What he did not know was how quickly stories would spread. By morning, the incident had already begun to change shape. In Yazoo County, men spoke of an ambush by river thieves, of Hargreaves' narrow escape. By noon, the detail of the boy had been added, then embellished. Some said the child had cried over the traitor, begged him not to die. Others said he had been ordered to help, that fear alone had driven him. Elijah heard these versions as he ran errands through town, his head down, his ears open. He did not correct anyone. Truth, he had learned, was rarely what people wanted. Hargreaves survived the journey to town, though barely. A doctor was summoned, his hands quick and his face grim. Lucky, the man said afterward, wiping his tools. Another inch and he'd be dead. Hargreave drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain dragging him under again and again. In those moments between fragments surfaced, fog, knives, the boy's face hovering above him. Find him, he murmured once. The boy. No one knew which boy he meant. 2 days later, Elijah was sent to the house where Hargreave lay recovering. The order came down quietly, as such orders often did. Run over there, the overseer said. Make yourself useful. Elijah understood immediately what this meant. He also understood that refusing was not an option. He went. The house smelled of medicine and stale sweat. Curtains were drawn to keep out the sun, turning the rooms dim and heavy. Hargreave lay propped on pillows, his chest bound, his face gray beneath the beard he had not yet been able to shave. When he saw Elijah, something like recognition flickered, and then faded. You, he said. His voice was weak but still carried authority. Come closer. Elijah did. You were there, Hargreave said. On the road. Yes, sir. You helped. Yes, sir. Hargreave studied him, his gaze lingering longer this time. What's your name? Elijah. No last name. That was how it was done. Hargreave nodded slowly. You saved my life. The words hung between them, heavy and absurd. Elijah said nothing. I will not forget that, Hargreave continued. You hear me? Yes, sir. What Hargreave meant was gratitude. What Elijah heard was opportunity. Over the following days, Elijah returned again and again. He carried water, fetched food, relayed messages. He moved through the house as if he belonged there, his presence fading into the background. Hargreave watched him with growing ease, mistaking quiet for loyalty. Good boy, he said once and meant it. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was that the River Road incident had bound their lives together in ways that could not be undone. Mercy had been shown. And mercy, once given, had a way of demanding payment. Recovery did not soften Caleb Hargreave. It sharpened him. Pain had a way of clarifying priorities, and as the wounds knit slowly beneath their bindings, his mind returned to the familiar comfort of calculation. He lay in the dimness of the sick room, listening to the house breathe around him. The creak of beams, the distant clatter of dishes, the low murmur of voices from rooms he no longer occupied, and he thought about survival. About debts unpaid. About routes delayed. About how close he had come to vanishing into the mud like an unmarked grave. And about the boy. Elijah moved through the house with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood the value of invisibility. He brought water at dawn and again at dusk. He carried trays without clatter, stepped where the boards were firm, avoided the places where servants lingered and talk grew careless. When Hargreave slept, Elijah waited in the corner with his back to the wall, eyes open, cataloging everything. The doctor had said rest was essential. Hargreave ignored this whenever possible. Sit, he told the boy one afternoon, gesturing weakly toward a chair near the bed. Tell me what you saw. Elijah sat. He kept his hands folded, his gaze lowered just enough to appear respectful. There were men, he said. I did not know them. How many? 2. Maybe 3. Faces? No, sir. Fog. Hargreave frowned, dissatisfied but not surprised. Fog covered many things. He let the matter rest for now. Why did you help me? He asked instead. The question was not gentle. It was the sort of inquiry that expected an answer aligned with comfort. Elijah thought of the road, the blood, the way the traitor's breath had rattled like something broken. He thought of his mother's last smile. He chose his words carefully. Because you were hurt. Hargreave studied him for a long moment, then laughed softly, a sound that pulled at his bandages. Simple, he said. I like simple. He began to give Elijah small privileges. Extra food. The ability to linger in the house after errands were complete. Access to rooms most boys never entered. He told himself this was generosity, a reward for loyalty, a way to keep close the child who had, by chance or fate, preserved his life. What he did not recognize was the shift in power taking place beneath his notice. At night, when the house settled and the lamps burned low, Elijah listened. Hargreaves spoke freely then, the pain loosening his tongue. He complained of buyers and sellers, of owners who demanded too much and paid too little. He spoke of towns along the river where business was brisk, of plantations where trouble brewed beneath the surface. He spoke of ledgers. "Everything's there," Hargreave muttered once, half asleep. "Names don't lie. Numbers don't forget." Elijah filed that away. When he returned to the quarters, he said nothing of what he heard. He lay on his pallet and stared at the ceiling, replaying conversations word for word. Around him, whispers drifted through the dark. Fears, rumors, prayers offered without conviction. Elijah absorbed them all, sorting truth from panic, signal from noise. A woman asked him once, careful not to draw attention, "You safe over there?" "As safe as anywhere," he replied. It was not reassurance. It was observation. Days passed. Then weeks. Hargreave grew stronger, his voice regaining its authority, his temper returning in full. Yet the boy remained. Useful. Quiet. Present. "Ride with me," Hargreave said one morning, surprising everyone, including himself. They traveled short distances at first, Hargreave still too weak for long journeys. Elijah sat on the wagon's edge, the road unspooling beneath them. He learned the routes, the landmarks, the places where patrols lingered and where they did not. He learned how traders spoke to one another, the codes embedded in casual remarks. "2 barrels this time," one man said in a tavern. "Strong stock." Elijah knew what that meant. What none of them noticed was how the boy's silence changed. It grew heavier, more deliberate. He asked no questions. He did not need to. Answers volunteered themselves to those who waited long enough. One evening, as Hargreave dozed with a book open on his chest, Elijah's gaze drifted to the small desk by the window. A ledger lay there, its cover worn smooth by years of use. Hargreave guarded it closely when awake. When asleep, he forgot. Elijah did not move. Not yet. He had learned patience the hard way. Later, in the quarters, he unfolded the scrap of cloth his mother had given him. It was thinner now, the fabric weakened by time and touch. He pressed it to his face, inhaled, and for a moment allowed himself to feel the ache he kept buried. Then he folded it carefully and hid it away. Mercy had brought him here. Mercy had placed him within reach of truths meant to remain hidden. Elijah understood even then that mercy was not an end. It was a beginning. A door opened just wide enough for a child to slip through. What he did not yet know was how far that door would lead. But the weapon was already in his hand. And soon he would learn how to use it. It happened on a night when the house felt too still, as if even the insects outside had learned to hold their breath. Caleb Hargreave had taken to sleeping in short, broken intervals. Pain still visited him in the dark like an old creditor, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore, yet he refused to surrender to it completely. He would doze, wake, drink water, mutter about numbers, then drift again. Each time he woke, he reached instinctively for the ledger, as though ink and columns could protect him from death. That night he did not. The book lay on the desk by the window, half open, a weight of leather and secrets resting in plain view. Candlelight pooled around it, warm and soft, making the pages look almost innocent. Almost. Elijah stood in the corner as he always did, back to the wall. And still. Eyes lowered. The posture of obedience so perfect it became a kind of camouflage. Hargreave's breathing slowed. His chin sank to his chest. The room began to fill with that peculiar silence that only comes when someone crosses from waking into helplessness. Elijah waited longer than he needed to. He knew what impatience cost. A board creaked somewhere in the hallway, settling wood, not footsteps. The curtains stirred faintly as the humid night air pushed in. Elijah's heartbeat did not change. He moved with the quiet certainty of a boy who had spent years learning where sound lived and how to step around it. He crossed the room and stopped at the desk. For a moment he simply looked. The ledger was thicker than it appeared from a distance, its spine worn smooth, corners softened by use. It was not just a book. It was a monument, one man's private religion written in ink. Elijah's fingers hovered above it, and he felt something like revulsion, not at the leather, but at what it contained. Names. Lives reduced to marks. He lifted the cover with 2 fingers, careful not to let it scrape the wood. The first pages were familiar enough. Routes, expenses, tallies of coin and food. Hargreave recorded everything, even the smallest purchases, as if precision could cleanse the act itself. Elijah turned pages slowly, eyes scanning. He could read better than most thought because his mother had taught him letters in stolen moments, tracing them in dust, whispering sounds like prayers. A column of dates. A column of places. Then the section he had been listening for without knowing it. The entries changed tone there. The handwriting remained neat, but the words were colder, stripped of any pretense of humanity. A list of names ran down the page, each followed by numbers and brief descriptions, the way one might describe livestock. Male 24 strong back. Female 30 sewing. Boy 9 quiet. Elijah's throat tightened. He read that line twice as if it might change. Boy 9 quiet. A wave of heat rose behind his eyes. Not tears. Something harder. Something like a door slamming shut inside him. He kept turning pages. There were symbols in the margins, small marks that meant nothing to Elijah at first. A circle. A cross. A dash. Then on certain entries a tiny letter. R. Elijah stared at it until the candlelight blurred. He flipped forward faster, careful but urgent now. His fingers found a place where the paper had been smudged by sweat, as though Hargreave himself had hesitated over that page. And there it was. Ruth, 32, sewing, good disposition. Sold south, September 1848, transferred Yazoo Depot, then Natchez route. Elijah's breath went shallow. The room seemed to narrow around him. For a moment, he was 9 again, standing in dust with a bucket slipping from his hand, watching a wagon swallow the shape of his mother. Natchez route. That meant markets near the river, where names got rewritten, where people disappeared into new ownership like stones into deep water. It meant she might still be alive, or might have been sold so many times her name no longer belonged to her. Elijah's hands trembled once, a small betrayal of the control he had trained into himself. He curled his fingers into his palm until the shaking stopped. Then he saw it. A second note beneath her entry, lighter ink, later edition. Moved again, winter 1849, buyer, F. W. No last name. Just initials. Elijah's mind began to work like a blade finding its edge. Initials were not accidents. Hargreave used them when he wanted to conceal something from anyone who might someday read over his shoulder. Elijah leaned closer, eyes narrowing as he traced other entries with the same letters. F. W. appeared again and again. Different people. Different dates. Same initials. And on one page, half hidden near the spine, where the book resisted laying flat, Elijah found a list set apart from the rest, written smaller, as if the ink itself feared to be seen. Families, keep separate if needed. Beneath it, names grouped in clusters. Mothers with children. Husbands with wives. Siblings. The groups were marked not with compassion but with strategy, the way one might note which pieces of a machine could be sold separately for greater profit. Elijah scanned the clusters. Then his stomach dropped. There was a name he recognized from the quarters, an older woman known for tending the sick, for whispering prayers over fevered bodies. A woman who had once touched Elijah's shoulder and asked if he was safe. Her name appeared in ink, and next to it 2 children listed with her. But those children were still here. Elijah froze, the candle flame wavering as if it sensed the shift in the room. If the ledger showed them sold, if Hargreave believed they were moved, then something was wrong. Either Hargreave had lied in his own records, or someone else had altered the truth, or a transaction had been delayed and the danger had not yet arrived. All 3 possibilities were deadly. A sound came from the bed. Hargreave shifted, groaning softly, his hand twitching as though reaching for the book even in sleep. Elijah's body went cold with precision. He shut the ledger halfway, not enough to make noise, not enough to crease the page, just enough to pause, then waited. Hargreave's breathing deepened again. Elijah opened the book once more, but now he read with a different hunger. Not grief alone. Not rage alone. Purpose. He memorized what he could. The date beside Ruth's sale, the Natchez route, the repeated initials, the towns. He could not take the book. He could not tear a page. That would be noticed. And if Hargreave noticed, he would tighten every door, lock every drawer, cut off access to the one thing Elijah had never been allowed, truth. So Elijah did the only thing he had always been able to do. He kept it inside him. When he finally stepped away from the desk, he left the ledger exactly as it had been, pages aligned, cover resting in the same position as if no human hand had touched it. He returned to the wall and stood in the darkness with his eyes lowered, the perfect obedient boy. But the boy was not the same anymore, because now he knew what no one wanted him to know. His mother's name still existed somewhere in the world, written in a man's private book like a sin. And Elijah Moore had just discovered the map. The ledger did not feel like paper anymore. It felt like a pulse. Elijah carried it in his mind the way other boys carried hymns, line by line, symbol by symbol, reciting it silently while he walked, while he worked, while he pretended to be nothing more than a thin child with quick hands and an obedient gaze. The names were not just names. They were coordinates. Proof. A map of how people vanished. And maps, Elijah understood, were meant to be followed. He did not run at once. Running was a shout. Running was a confession. Running was a story that could be hunted. Instead, he did what the Delta taught any creature that wanted to survive. He moved without announcing himself. He listened until he knew where the weak boards were. It began with the boatmen. On the Yazoo River, not far from where the water thickened into the Mississippi, there was a landing used for barrels, timber, and the quiet exchange of goods no one wanted written down. Men in town called it a place for work. Enslaved people called it something else, spoken under breath, because names had power and the river carried names away. Elijah was sent there with a message for Hargreave, an errand thin as a thread, but enough to place him where the river men moved. The boatman's name was Isaiah Grant. He was free, though freedom in the Delta was a narrow strip of land between two swamps. He kept papers folded in oilcloth, carried them like a talisman, and still watched every white man's hands as if expecting a chain to leap from them. His skin was dark and weathered, his shoulders wide from years of pushing poles through stubborn current. He looked at Elijah once and knew what kind of boy he was. Not loud, not pleading, watching. What you need? Isaiah asked as if they were discussing flour or rope. Elijah held out the message. Isaiah glanced at it, then at the boy. You one of Hargreaves? The words sounded casual. They were not. Elijah's mouth stayed neutral. I go where I'm told. Isaiah nodded slowly, understanding the shape of that answer. Elijah did not speak of the ledger. Not yet. He spoke of the river instead, where it ran shallow, where it swallowed wagons whole, where patrols liked to sit with rifles across their knees pretending they were guarding the state and not their own fear. Isaiah listened. Then he leaned in, voice dropping. You hear things, don't you? Elijah met his eyes just long enough to make the truth unmistakable. Yes. Isaiah's expression hardened, not with anger, but with calculation. Then hear this. The river's got roads too. Roads you can't see unless somebody shows you. Elijah felt something shift inside him, a small click like a lock turning. Who shows? Elijah asked. Isaiah's gaze drifted toward the far bank where trees crowded close, their branches hanging like curtains. People who want the same thing you want, he said. And people who'll kill you if you ask wrong. That was the Delta's first rule. Every door had 2 guards, one outside, one inside. Elijah went back to the plantation with the message delivered and the river's words lodged in his bones. That night, in the quarters, he watched the faces around him differently. He listened for the soft signals people used when speech was too dangerous. A pause too long, a glance toward the woods, a name left unfinished. He found the driver next. His name was Moses Carter, and he wore authority like a borrowed coat. Never comfortable, always aware it could be snatched away. The owner had made him driver because Moses was strong, because he was smart, because he could count bales and measure rows and make other men move without the overseer lifting a whip. That position earned him a little extra food and a lot of hatred. Enslaved people did not trust drivers. They could not afford to. And drivers did not trust anyone, because they lived in the narrow space where masters smiled at them and still owned their children. Elijah approached him at dusk, when the field emptied and the day's exhaustion made even anger feel heavy. Moses watched him come. You need something? Moses asked. Elijah held out nothing. No message. No excuse. That alone was a risk. I saw the trader's book, Elijah said quietly. Moses went still. Not startled, controlled. His eyes flicked left and right, scanning the path. That book'll get you killed, Moses said. Elijah nodded. It already got people killed. Moses's jaw tightened. For a moment he looked older than he was. What you want from me, boy? Elijah did not say revenge. That would have sounded childish. He did not say freedom. That sounded like a dream. He said what was real. I want names to mean something, Elijah said. I want to know where they go. Moses exhaled slowly through his nose, like a man trying to keep his temper from becoming a weapon. You got one name in mind, he said. Elijah's hand moved to his pocket without thinking, touching the scrap of cloth hidden there. Yes. Moses looked at him for a long time. Then, finally, he spoke with a bitterness so quiet it could have been mistaken for calm. River towns. Natchez. Vicksburg. Places where folks vanish and the world keeps eating supper like nothing happened. Elijah felt his chest tighten. The ledger had said Natchez. Moses confirmed it without even knowing. You know more than you saying, Elijah pressed. Moses's eyes narrowed. And you do too. They stared at each other, two lives trapped in the same machine, both looking for the place to jam a stick into the gears. What you planning? Moses asked. Elijah's answer came without hesitation. I'm listening, he said. I'm gathering. I'm waiting. Moses's laugh was short and humorless. That's a plan, he said. But it ain't enough. Waiting don't break chains. It just makes you old in him. Elijah did not flinch. Then tell me who breaks them. Moses hesitated as if weighing the danger of each word. There's a woman in town, he said at last. White. Widow. Runs a sewing shop. Folks say she got soft hands and a hard heart. Folks also say she writes letters and burns them after. Elijah's pulse quickened. Her name? Moses's lips barely moved. Catherine Wren. Elijah repeated it silently, locking it away. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was that Catherine Wren had already heard whispers of Hargreaves' ambush. She had already asked questions that made certain men uncomfortable. She had already decided, months earlier, that the delta was rotting and someone had to cut into it before the whole body turned black. Elijah was not the only one building a network. He was simply the one with the map. And in the days that followed, each connection, river, driver, widow, tightened like a noose around a truth the county did not want spoken. Soon the quiet would not be quiet anymore. Elijah did not tell Isaiah about the ledger on the riverbank. Not then. A secret spoken too early did not become a plan, it became a corpse. Instead, he began to move through the days as though nothing in him had changed, while inside his mind the map unfolded again and again. Natchez route. Yazoo Depot. W. The clustered family names. The woman in the quarters whose children were still here but marked for separation. The quiet certainty that the ledger was not merely a record of what had happened, but a schedule for what would happen next. And schedules, Elijah had learned, could be interrupted. The first sign came as a smell. Not smoke, not yet, but lamp oil carried on a breeze that should have held only river damp and cotton dust. It drifted through the quarters near midnight, sharp and unmistakable. Men stirred. A baby whimpered and was hushed. Somewhere, a board creaked under a cautious foot. Moses Carter appeared outside Elijah's cabin like a shadow given shape. He did not call the boy's name. He simply stood in the dark until Elijah emerged. You smell it? Moses said. Elijah nodded. You didn't spill nothing, Moses murmured. No. Moses's eyes moved, scanning the yard beyond the cabins. The main house sat higher on its rise, a white presence even in the dark, its windows dimmed. On the far side, the gin house and storage sheds hunched like animals asleep. Somebody wants a fire, Moses said, voice low as soil. Elijah felt his mouth go dry. Fires happened on plantations. Accidents happened. But everyone knew which fires were accidents and which were warnings. And if it burns, Elijah whispered, they blame us. Moses looked at him then hard. They blame us if it don't burn too. A sound carried from the direction of the big house. Faint, metallic. The soft scrape of a matchbox. The clink of glass. A man muttering to himself. Elijah's body tightened, every muscle alert. What he did not know was that above them, in one of the upstairs rooms, Caleb Hargreave had already woken. Hargreave's recovery had progressed enough that he slept in the guest room rather than the town doctor's office. He had insisted on it. He hated dependence. Yet tonight, pain had pulled him from sleep in a cold, sweating panic, the memory of knives returning like a fever dream. He sat up, listened, and heard something else beneath the normal sounds of night. Movement. Not servant movement. Not the lazy drift of a house settling. Purposeful steps. He reached for his pistol. His fingers found only air. He swore under his breath and slid his feet to the floor, every bruise and stitch protesting. In the hall outside, a lamp flared briefly, then dimmed again. Hargreaves' heart hammered. He moved to the door and opened it a crack. A man stood at the end of the hallway with a lantern held low. White, broad-shouldered. A stranger to the house. Hargreaves' throat tightened. What the hell are you doing in here? The stranger did not answer. He smiled, slow and empty, and raised his other hand. A bottle. Hargreave recognized the glint of oil immediately. He slammed the door, threw his weight against it, and in the next instant the hallway erupted with the wet slap of liquid thrown against wood. The smell surged, oil, heavy and suffocating. Hargreaves' mind raced. Fire did not just destroy property. It destroyed records. It erased routes. It swallowed debt and evidence alike. And suddenly the ledger, felt more precious than his own ribs. Down in the quarters, Elijah heard the first crackle. Not loud yet. Just a small, hungry sound like paper catching flame. Moses grabbed Elijah by the arm. Go, he hissed. Now. Where? Moses' jaw tightened. To the river. Find Isaiah. Elijah moved without hesitation, feet silent on packed dirt. He slipped between cabins, past sleeping bodies, past a woman clutching her child with eyes wide and unblinking. The air grew thicker with smoke as he ran. Behind him, the first shout rose from the direction of the big house. Fire. Then another. Wake up. Wake up. Dogs began barking, frantic and high-pitched. Horses screamed in their stalls. The plantation, so carefully controlled in daylight, turned feral in darkness. Elijah reached the edge of the yard and paused just long enough to look back. Flame licked along the porch rail of the main house, thin at first, then stronger, fed by oil. It crawled with an intelligence that felt almost intentional. Yellow light pulsed through windows. Smoke rolled upward in thick coils, swallowing the columns. Men stumbled into the yard half-dressed, shouting orders that contradicted one another. Buckets. Form a line. Get the women out. Where's the overseer? A patroller rode in from the road, horse-lathered, eyes wide. What happened here? He yelled. No one answered him because no one knew the truth yet. What none of them noticed, what they would not understand until later, was that the fire was not the only thing moving through the plantation that night. In the chaos, doors were left unguarded. Locks were forgotten. People ran without counting who ran beside them. Elijah used that. He cut behind the smoke, slipping toward the shed where Hargreaves sometimes stored goods before transport. The heat was already fierce, pressing against his skin, drying his throat. Sparks drifted down like insects. The shed door was latched. Elijah's fingers moved quickly, finding the weak point, lifting it. The interior smelled of rope and wood and old sweat. Crates stacked along the wall. A canvas tarp thrown over something bulky. He pulled the tarp back. Chains. Neatly coiled. Ready. Elijah stared at them for a single endless moment. Then he heard footsteps outside, heavy, stumbling, urgent. He froze, breath held. The door creaked. A voice, harsh and panicked. Anybody in here? Elijah's mind snapped into motion. He slid behind the crates, making his body small as smoke seeped in. The footsteps moved closer. A lantern beam swept the room, cutting through dust. The man muttered, damn it, damn it. Then in the distance, a beam collapsed in the main house with a roar, and the man outside swore and ran back toward the fire. Elijah did not move until the sound of his steps vanished. When he finally emerged, he did not take the chains. He took something smaller. A satchel hanging from a nail near the door, leather, worn, familiar. Hargreaves' traveling bag. Inside would be papers. Money. Perhaps copies of routes. Perhaps, if God had a cruel sense of irony, the very names Elijah needed. He slung it over his shoulder and ran into the smoke. By the time he reached the river path, the plantation behind him was a burning landmark visible for miles. Men would later swear they heard screams from the flames. Some said human, some said not. Historians would debate whether those screams were real or whether guilt simply gave the fire a voice. But Elijah did not look back. He ran toward the river because the river was the only road that did not belong to a master. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, Isaiah Grant waited with unseen routes and dangerous answers. By the time Elijah reached the riverbank, the night behind him had become a wound that would not close. Fire lit the sky in pulses, a distant, furious breathing that turned the low clouds orange and red. Ash drifted on the wind and settled on Elijah's hair and shoulders like gray snow. He tasted smoke with every breath. His legs burned, not from pain but from the effort of restraint. He had learned to run without panic, to conserve even fear. Isaiah Grant stood where he always did, half-shadowed by cypress knees, one hand resting on a skiff pulled up into the reeds. He did not ask why a plantation was burning. He did not ask why a boy came running out of that direction with a leather satchel slung across his chest. He asked the only question that mattered. Is it time? Elijah nodded. Isaiah pushed the skiff into the water with a practiced shove. The river accepted it without sound, black and patient. Elijah stepped in, the boards cool beneath his feet, and Isaiah took up the pole. They moved away from the bank as quietly as breath leaving a body. Only when the fire was partially hidden by a bend in the river did Isaiah speak again. You know what you're carrying? He asked. Yes, Elijah said. And not all of it. Isaiah's mouth tightened. Then you best be ready to finish learning fast. They drifted for several minutes, the skiff slipping along a current that smelled of mud and decay and life all at once. Frogs croaked. An owl called from somewhere high and unseen. The world felt unchanged, indifferent to human disaster. Elijah opened the satchel with hands that finally began to shake. Inside were folded papers tied with string, coin wrapped in cloth, a small pistol he did not touch, and beneath it all, a second ledger, thinner than the first but newer, cleaner. This one had not been meant for long-term keeping. This one was for movement. Elijah untied the string and spread the pages carefully across his knees. Routes, dates, initials, and names. Isaiah leaned closer, lantern hooded so its light barely escaped. Read, Isaiah said. Elijah did. He read until his voice went hoarse and his eyes burned. He read of shipments planned but not yet executed. Of families marked for separation within weeks. Of buyers who preferred quiet transactions far from towns. Of initials that appeared again and again, F. W. Attached to the most profitable, most brutal transfers. And then he found her. Not under Ruth Moore. Under another name. A name altered just enough to pass unnoticed by anyone who did not know how traders thought. But Elijah knew. He knew because the ledger noted something small beside it, something Hargreave had once mentioned aloud without realizing anyone was listening. Refuse's new name. Stubborn. Elijah's chest tightened so hard he thought it might break. She alive, he said. Isaiah closed his eyes briefly, as if offering thanks to something older than prayer. Where? Elijah traced the line with his finger. Plantation east of Natchez. Owner's name's written here. He expects delivery in 3 days. 3 days. Isaiah exhaled slowly. That ain't much time. No, Elijah said. It's enough. They beached the skiff beneath a stand of trees where the river bent sharply, hiding them from any patrols that might pass. Dawn was beginning to pale the eastern sky, the fire's glow fading into something like shame. Isaiah looked at Elijah, then really looked at him, not as a boy but as a force he did not yet fully understand. You know what saving her means? Isaiah said. It won't stop with her. Once you pull a thread like this, the whole cloth comes apart. Elijah thought of the names clustered together in the ledger. The woman in the quarters. Her children. The others whose fates were already inked. I know, he said. And you know what not saving her means, Isaiah continued. Living with it. Same as the rest of us. Elijah did not answer immediately. He looked back upriver, toward the place where fire still smoldered and men would soon begin writing lies to explain what they could not admit. I saved him, Elijah said quietly. Isaiah nodded. I heard. He didn't deserve it. No. But I did it anyway. Isaiah waited. Elijah's voice did not shake when he finished. That was mercy, he said. This is choice. They moved that day like men already condemned and therefore free. Isaiah knew which landings were watched and which were forgotten. He knew which white men could be paid to look away and which could not be trusted at any price. They gathered what they needed from places that existed in the cracks of the system. Food, dry clothes, information traded in murmurs. By nightfall, they reached the edge of Natchez. The plantation lay a mile inland, past a stretch of cane and low ground that stank of stagnant water. They watched it from the trees as lanterns moved between buildings and dogs patrolled the perimeter in lazy arcs. Elijah studied the place with a calm that unsettled Isaiah. What you thinking? Isaiah whispered. Elijah did not look away. I'm thinking, he said, that he's going to see me again. Isaiah understood immediately. You sure? Elijah nodded. Caleb Hargreave had survived knives. He had survived fire. He had survived long enough to believe himself chosen by fortune. What he did not know, what he could not imagine, was that the boy who saved his life had just finished deciding how it would end. And that decision, once made, would not be undone. The lie took shape before the truth ever reached daylight. By dawn, smoke from the Yazoo plantation had thinned into a gray smear against the sky, and men were already rehearsing what they would say. Fire was blamed on carelessness, a tipped lamp, a drunk overseer, anything that did not require intent, anything that did not ask who benefited from the flames. Caleb Hargreave arrived in Natchez that same afternoon, wrapped in bandages and fury. He had ridden hard despite his injuries, driven by a fear he would not name. The fire had taken more than wood and cloth. It had taken certainty. He told himself the satchel was replaceable. Numbers could be rewritten. Routes recalculated. Names reacquired. But beneath that reassurance lay a splinter of doubt he could not dislodge. Someone had known where to strike. The plantation east of Natchez belonged to Franklin Weller, a man who prized discretion above cruelty, not because he lacked it, but because he preferred his violence quiet and unexamined. His fields were smaller than those upriver, his house less grand, but his profits steady. He liked his affairs orderly, predictable. The delivery scheduled for that week was meant to be exactly that. Weller walked the yard as dusk fell, hands clasped behind his back, listening to the sounds of his property settling into night. Crickets, distant voices, the low whine of insects gathering near lanterns. He had not yet been informed of the fire. News traveled slowly when it threatened comfort. Ruth, under another name now, sat in a cabin near the far edge of the quarters, her wrists bound loosely, more symbol than restraint. She had not stopped resisting names. Each new one slid off her like water, leaving no mark. It earned her punishment. It also kept something inside her intact. She sensed change before she saw it. The dogs grew restless as night deepened, pacing instead of sleeping. Lanterns moved where none usually did. Voices carried sharper edges. Ruth lifted her head, listening. What he did not know was that two sets of eyes watched the plantation from opposite directions. Elijah lay flat in the brush at the edge of the cane, the earth cool beneath his chest. Isaiah was a dark shape beside him, breath slow, steady. They had been there since sunset, watching the rhythm of the place reveal itself. Guards passed every quarter hour. Dogs circled in lazy loops. One lantern by the main house burned brighter than the rest. "That's him," Isaiah murmured. Elijah followed the line of his gaze. Caleb Hargreaves stood near the house steps, speaking with Weller in low tones. His posture was stiff, pain still shaping his movements, but his voice carried the same authority. He gestured once toward the quarters, a small, precise motion. Elijah's jaw tightened. "They know," Isaiah said. "Not yet," Elijah replied. "They suspect. And suspicion's enough to kill 4. Elijah did not answer. He was counting. Steps. Distances. The moment when the guard's paths crossed and left a space unobserved. It came. Elijah moved. He did not run. Running drew eyes. He slipped through the cane and across the open ground in a low, careful line, timing his movement with the guards' backs turned. Isaiah followed a different path, circling wide toward the riverside, where escape waited if needed. Elijah reached the cabin without being seen. Inside, Ruth stiffened as the door creaked open. She did not cry out. Years had taught her that noise was rarely rewarded. "Elijah," she whispered, disbelief cutting through exhaustion. He knelt before her, hands working quickly at the rope. "We do not have long," he said. "You can walk." She nodded, tears finally slipping free, silent and hot. Outside, a shout rose from the yard. "Who's there?" Hargreave turned, his heart lurching as a shape moved where it should not have been. Recognition struck him like a blow. "The boy," he breathed. He broke into a run despite the pain, shouting orders that collided with one another in the air. "Stop him. Get the dogs." Elijah heard the noise and knew the window had closed. He led his mother out the back of the cabin, keeping low, guiding her through the narrow gap between buildings. A dog barked, sharp and sudden. Lantern light swung toward them. Isaiah's shot cracked the night open. The dog dropped. Men shouted. Chaos bloomed. Elijah did not look back. They reached the trees as gunfire erupted behind them, shots wild and panicked. Branches tore at Ruth's dress. Elijah pulled her onward, strength flooding his small frame from somewhere beyond muscle. At the edge of the river, Isaiah was already there, skiff half in the water. Hargreave burst from the brush moments later, breath ragged, pistol raised. "Elijah," he shouted. "You owe me your life." Elijah stopped. For one suspended moment, everything stilled. The river, the men, the past pressing close enough to touch. "I paid it back," Elijah said. He pushed the skiff free. A shot rang out, splintering wood inches from where Elijah had stood. The current caught the boat and carried it away as Isaiah took up the pole, driving them into darkness. Hargreave fell to his knees at the riverbank, the sound torn from him something between a scream and a prayer. By morning, Weller would claim ignorance. Hargreave would claim theft. Patrols would ride and find nothing. The official story would be neat and bloodless. But somewhere on the river, a lie was already unraveling. Because this time the names had escaped the page. The river carried them for 3 nights before it gave them a dawn that felt almost clean. Elijah remembered that morning not for its beauty but for its strangeness, the way light touched Ruth's face as if it had been waiting years to find her again. She sat low in the skiff, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, her hands trembling from exhaustion and disbelief. The lines around her mouth were deeper than he remembered, her eyes sharper, more wary. Yet when she looked at him, something softened that had not been allowed to soften in a long time. "You still got my cloth?" she asked, voice rough as river stone. Elijah reached into his pocket and placed the frayed scrap in her palm. Ruth held it as if it were a living thing. For a moment she closed her eyes and pressed it to her lips. "I prayed you'd forget," she whispered. "Prayed you'd let it go." Elijah did not understand the tears in her voice until years later. Forgetting would have been mercy. Remembering was a chain of its own. "I could not," he said. Isaiah kept them moving along the quiet roads of water and shadow. Sometimes they hid in cane brakes where mosquitoes feasted. Sometimes they slept in abandoned shacks with floors soft from rot. Sometimes, when the river widened and traffic increased, Isaiah guided them into reeds and waited out the sound of steamboats. Those floating palaces that hauled cotton and human misery with equal indifference. News traveled even to the hidden. At a landing near a small river town, Isaiah traded coin for bread and brought back a whisper that made Ruth's hands go cold. "Hargreaves alive," Isaiah said. "He's telling folks a story." Elijah felt a pulse of heat behind his eyes. "What story?" Ruth asked. Isaiah hesitated, then spoke with the careful tone of a man describing a snake he had not yet killed. "He says a fire took his papers. He says an armed gang stole his property. He says a boy, your boy, was part of it." Ruth stared at Elijah as if seeing him in a new light. "You were seen," she said. Elijah's voice stayed calm. "I wanted him to see." Isaiah's expression tightened. "You want a man like that to see you, he won't stop looking." Elijah knew. That was the point. A hunter who looked in the wrong direction could be led. They reached safer ground eventually, ground that was not safe, only less watched. A free black family outside of Illinois took them in for a season, asking no questions that could not be answered. Ruth learned to sleep without shackles, but her body still woke at every sound. Elijah worked in a stable, then on a dock, hands growing hard, shoulders widening. He became a young man with a boy's silence and an adult's patience. And still he listened. Years later, historians would argue about whether the network that helped them was truly Underground Railroad in the organized sense, or simply the scattered courage of individuals who refused to obey the country's laws of cruelty. The truth, as always, was complicated. The route was not a straight line. It was a series of human decisions made in darkness. One winter they received word, through a chain of cautious mouths, that Franklin Weller's plantation had changed hands. That Hargreave had moved his trade farther south for a time, chasing profit and avoiding questions. That an investigator from the state had visited Yazoo County and left quickly, claiming he found nothing worth pursuing. What he did not know was that people had begun keeping their own records. In church basements, in kitchens, in the back rooms of small businesses, names were written down, not for sale but for remembrance. Elijah met Catherine Wren again years after Moses first spoke her name, in a cramped room above a printer's shop. She was older, hair pinned tight, eyes sharper than rumor had suggested. "You're the boy," she said. "I was," Elijah replied. She slid a folded paper across the table. "I kept copies. Not all. Enough." Elijah opened it and saw familiar marks, routes, initials, the same cold order of prophet. W. Natchez Route. Yazoo Depot. "You could have burned these," he said. Catherine's mouth tightened. "Burning is easy. Keeping is dangerous. I chose dangerous." Ruth watched from the corner, silent. When Elijah looked at her, he saw something he had never seen before. Not only survival, but intention. They did not return to Mississippi. Not openly. Not in daylight. But the Delta never released its grip entirely. Even far north, the news reached them in fragments. The Fugitive Slave Act tightening like a fist, bounty hunters moving with federal blessing, free men dragged south in chains. Ruth's freedom was always conditional, protected by papers, by community, by luck. And Elijah's memory remained a blade. By 1861, war began to rumble through the nation like distant thunder. Elijah watched men enlist with fire in their eyes, watched flags rise and fall, watched newspapers turn blood into headlines. When the war ended and slavery was declared dead on paper, the South did not become kind. It became inventive. In Reconstruction years, Ruth worked with other women to teach children their letters. Elijah helped build a schoolhouse with his own hands, the boards rough under his palms. They believed, for a brief, fragile stretch of time, that the country might actually change. Then the backlash came, quiet at first, then open. New laws. New patrols. New masks in the night. Old violence wearing fresh clothes. One evening in 1874, a stranger arrived at the schoolhouse after dark. He carried himself like a man used to being welcomed. His coat was fine. His hands were clean. Elijah knew him anyway. Caleb Hargreave was older now, hair gray at the temples, but his eyes were the same, sharp, hungry, certain of his own rightness. Ruth stood behind Elijah, hand on his shoulder, as if steadying herself against a wave. Hargreave smiled, slow and unpleasant. "Found you at last," he said. Elijah's voice was almost gentle. "No," he said. "You found the place I wanted you to come." Hargreave's smile faltered. Just slightly. Outside the wind shifted. Somewhere in the dark, footsteps moved, more than one pair. Men who did not speak. Men who did not need to. What none of them knew, not even Ruth, was that Elijah had spent 23 years turning mercy into a trap. And now the man who sold his mother had stepped into it. Caleb Hargreave did not understand the silence at first. He stood just inside the schoolhouse doorway, hat in hand, his practiced smile still arranged on his face like a shield. The room smelled of chalk and old wood, of oil lamps and ink. Children's slates were stacked neatly on a shelf. A map of the United States hung crooked on the wall, its edges frayed from use. It did not look like a trap. "You built something," Hargreave said, forcing admiration into his voice. "Did not expect that." Elijah said nothing. The footsteps outside grew closer. Slow. Measured. Not rushed, not angry. The sound of men who had already decided what would happen next. Ruth stepped forward then, her posture straight despite the years carved into her body. Lantern light caught her face fully for the first time. Hargreave's eyes narrowed, searching memory the way a man searches a burned field for something he once owned. Recognition came late. "You," he said. Ruth did not answer him. She did not need to. Hargreave's breath hitched. His hand twitched at his side as if reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. He laughed once, thin and brittle. "So this is it," he said. "You think a room full of books frightens me?" Elijah finally spoke. "No," he said. "The books are not for you." The men entered then, 3 of them black and white together, faces set, eyes steady. One carried a folded bundle of papers tied with twine. Another held a lantern high, its light unflinching. Hargreave backed up a step. "What is this?" he demanded. Elijah took the papers and laid them out on a desk. Old ink. Familiar columns. Names written carefully, patiently, by many hands over many years. "You kept records," Elijah said. "So did we." Hargreave's mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time since Elijah had known him, words failed. "These are copies," Elijah continued. "Routes, dates, buyers, sellers, initials you thought no one would understand." He tapped one page. F.W. Hargreave's shoulders sagged. The weight of years pressed down on him all at once. "You cannot prove." "We already have," Elijah said. The truth did not arrive with violence. It arrived with inevitability. Hargreave was not killed that night. That would have been simple. Instead, he was exposed, quietly, methodically. The papers were sent north, then farther still. To churches. To newspapers that could not be easily silenced. To men who had grown rich enough to believe themselves untouchable. When the accusations came, they came from everywhere at once. By the time Hargreave was arrested in 1876, he was a small story buried beneath larger ones. Reconstruction was collapsing. New laws were being written to replace old chains with cleaner language. Few cared about an aging traitor accused of crimes most preferred to forget. He died in a Mississippi jail 2 years later, of fever and neglect. No obituary mentioned Elijah Moore. None mentioned Ruth. Official records listed his occupation simply as merchant. That was the last lie he was allowed. Ruth lived another 12 years. She died free in a small house filled with books and children who called her teacher. When she was buried, Elijah placed the scrap of cloth in her hands before the earth closed over her. He did not speak. He did not need to. Elijah Moore never sought credit for what he had done. Some said he helped others escape during the war. Others said he worked with record keepers who believed memory itself was a form of resistance. A few claimed he disappeared west, where the past had not yet decided what shape it would take. No photograph of him survives. But fragments do. A ledger page copied in careful handwriting. A letter signed only with initials. A story passed down in families who remembered a boy who listened when others spoke too loudly. Years later, a historian would write that there was no proof Elijah Moore ever existed. And perhaps that was the final mercy he chose. because stories like his were never meant to sit safely in books. They were meant to move quietly from mind to mind, reminding the living that even in the most brutal systems, someone is always watching. Someone is always remembering. What do you think Elijah's mercy truly was? Kindness, or the most patient form of justice? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more dark historical stories like this, stories that blur the line between documented history and buried truth, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who believes these voices still matter. These stories were meant to be forgotten. That is exactly why they must be told.